You're listening to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic adventure games. I am Jason Compton, and this is episode 10 of our podcast, and we have some firsts. This is the first time we're going to be covering an Infocom title, and it's also the first time one of our players was not part of the original triumvirate from episode 1, as we welcome Nick Moffitt to the program. Nick, welcome to The Retro Adventurers.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Nick, before we talk about our games today, I'd like to talk just a little bit about you, how you got here, the domain that you own that many of our listeners in the Retro Adventurers community would covet. Who are you and how did you get here?
Right. So, how did I get here? Well, I started out, my parents, the first computer we bought was a Commodore 128. And it was a bundle that came with a game called Bureaucracy, which was one of the Infocom titles that did not run on the Commodore 64. So it was sort of a special release for the 128 that required all of its massive power for the era. And as my parents were sort of, they were sort of academic types in a way. They were both librarians. They very much loved the Infocom titles, and they got us all text adventures primarily. And so while all of my colleagues in school were playing, action adventure games and arcade games, we were getting A Mind Forever Voyaging or Trinity or Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy at home. So it very much appealed to their sensibilities, and they tried to raise us to sort of love the written word and to interact with computers through this. And as a result, I have a lot of very fond memories of Infocom games in particular, but we also, we had quite a few other adventures. We did have the Hobbit, which was, I believe, covered on an earlier episode of this show.
Yeah, episode 2.
Episode 2. And we had a few others. We had quite a few. So that was primarily what gaming on a computer was to me in the 80s and early 90s. And I didn't really have access to modern hardware for a long time. So I kept playing text adventures into the sort of Inform Renaissance, which brought out a lot of independent works targeting exactly the same platforms and exactly the same interface. So when it came time in the mid-90s for me to register a domain for my Linux server on the net at a university network, I was sort of gobsmacked that Zork.net was available. I thought, well, I'll register it, and they'll obviously deny it because clearly Zork.net can't be available. That's ridiculous. And I've had it for a good 30 years now. So, that's, it's rather strange that I have Zork.net. I've used it for everything. I always have to spell it to everyone, whenever I'm giving out my email address. But, I've loved it. Loved Zork, loved the genre.
Excellent. And you mentioning the Commodore 128 and the fact that Bureaucracy, Trinity, Beyond Zork, Infocom's dedication to publishing for a lot of different platforms, being one of one of the first and only software companies to really commit to the Commodore 128 platform and try to publish games specifically for it. It's a machine that for all the machines that it sold, there's really not a whole lot of Commodore 128 specific software for it. But Infocom did publish for it. And Infocom's loyalty and dedication to a broad spectrum of platforms is going to come up when we talk about Lurking Horror, which is our main course today. But as we always do on the Retro Adventurers, we have an appetizer course as well. And the theme for this episode is horror games. And there are some other things in common between the Lurking Horror, our main course by Infocom, and our appetizer course, Crypt of Medea by Surtech Software. Some other parallels that we'll get into, but we'll take on the appetizer course now. This is a game, I don't know, Nick, if you delved into the world of kind of the broad spectrum hint books. Some people were big Shay Adams Quest for Clues fans, but I early on got a copy of The Book of Adventure Games by Kim Schuett. And it was because it was a tome of lots of different games for lots of different platforms. You'd read about these games, see the maps and the descriptions, and a lot of times they weren't available for my platform of choice, Commodore 64. But it was a way to kind of catalog browse and imagine what these games might be like. And that's how I first learned about Crypt of Medea, which for a game that was, some sources say released in 1984, it looks to me more like late 1983 based on magazine ads and just its inclusion in the Book of Adventure Games. It looks like a 1983 release. The fact that it was Apple II only is a little unusual because by that time you certainly had a large, if not particularly growing base of Atari 8-bits. You had a large and growing Commodore 64 base. The DOS market was certainly viable. So the fact that this was an Apple II only release kind of stands out. Might have to do with the game itself or the fact that Surtec just really wasn't much of an adventure game publisher. They were and really still today are best known for wizardry. So this game kind of stands out. Nick, had you had any exposure to Crypt of Medea before we talked and I proposed it for this episode?
I had had none, which was it was great because I got to open up the handbook, the manual that came with it, which did say copyright 1983 inside.
Yeah.
And I was actually very impressed with the level of hints and clues and other things, the way it led you into the game. Just as an introduction, I thought was fantastic. For example, a lot of the Infocom games that I grew up with, inside the manual, inside the browsy, there would be usually a sort of a sample transcript. It would always be fictional. It would always be a game that might be thematically related to the one you've just bought, but it would not be anything that would appear in that game or in indeed any Infocom game that actually existed. It would always be fictional.
Yes,
Whereas
those tantalizing transcript games. Yeah.
oh, I know, and they always made me want to play that game too sometimes. But yeah, so I was impressed with the fact that this really got you into the game very quickly from that manual. I could imagine, riding home on the bus from the software store with, flipping through this manual and already plotting out my first several moves from the tutorial, because it leads you through the very first couple of puzzles, just from the intro.
Yeah, which and it was an interesting choice because by late 1983, the market was fairly mature. This is a text graphics game, but it's not a split screen. It's a full screen Apple II color graphics, such as they are, and then by flipping the screens with the escape key, you can get to a full text interface. You can disable graphics, which might come in handy at some points because it's one of those games that redraws everything when you drop or pick up an object. But yeah, it was an interesting choice to kind of guide you through, and I thought it was effective to show, okay, this is the kind of world you're in, this is the kind of puzzles you're going to encounter, and here's how you kind of get rolling. And it did provide a reasonably narrative description of how you end up. You're driving in your car, and through a series of misfortune, you wake up in what appears to be a sealed tomb with no obvious means of escape. I played this on the Apple Win emulator. What did you use, Nick?
I used MAME to emulate the Apple
Oh,
II.
okay. Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, you had alerted me. I had overlooked it at first. The fact that this is a game that is trying a lot of different things. And there are definitely things I'm going to praise and respect it for. And it was trying to make use of the Mockingboard card, which was a fairly popular add-on card for the Apple II computers. Did you ever get MAME sorted out on the Mockingboard front?
I did. It was a little disappointing. It worked insofar as I could hear a buzzy voice reading out the text. I assumed it might be a little bit more atmospheric. Perhaps, some of those old synthesizer voices are a little bit evocative. I remember in particular the TI-99 one was fantastic. But yeah, it was a bit difficult to hear. And the other problem is that this game also makes such heavy use of audio. There are so many audio cues, little tunes, that sort of thing. And that would always seem to interrupt the audio stream. I don't know if that's MAME specific or if that was a problem on the original Apple II, but sometimes it would only get through one sentence of a room description and omit some rather important clues in the audio. So as an accessibility feature, I would not rely on the Mockingboard.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it was accessibility and how much was just, hey, it's relatively cheap from a code perspective to pump this text over to the Mockingboard, let it do its speech synth. Yeah, so basically the on-screen messages get read out. But yeah, the voice, at least as emulated in Apple Win, it was just kind of flat and bleh. If there were effects that they could have taken advantage of, they didn't particularly. But they tried a thing. And similarly, yeah, like you mentioned, a lot of little music cues. A lot of times when
Yes.
you solve a puzzle or kind of make a thing happen, you get a jaunty Apple speaker tune. And to that I say, they really tried.
They tried so hard, and they tried to make it at least, again, thematically linked to what was happening. I think, for example, if you dig with the shovel, it plays Whistle While You Work from Snow White, the Disney Snow White. Um, and there are a few other ones. I think when you uncover a corpse full of wriggling maggots, it plays that song, The Worms. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out,
Oh,
which was
that
a,
of course. I was trying
yeah.
to place it, and yes, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, I mean it's the what I remarked was that this game this game is excited to be the game. It felt like
Yes.
the authors are excited to share it with us with the musical interludes, the flashing text. They do some kind of on-screen text effects to represent puzzles and outcomes. It wants to entertain and it wants to be liked. Which and to go back to the Book of Adventure games, these passages had really stuck with me, and I'm just going to read them out because the way the author described it, he was not buying what they were selling. He described it as a humorless and gruesome game full of blood, gore, and little else. You find yourself in an underground mausoleum. Your mission is simply to escape. Decapitated corpses, flea-infested dogs, dead naturally, vats full of body pieces, and mutants stand in your way. I can't say much good about this game, either from the standpoint of its design or implementation. This game does not suit children because of its unnecessary use of violence and horror. The graphics and text are rather insipid. Nonetheless, the difficulty factor is relatively high, partly because of the atrocious vocabulary and partly because of the lack of logic associated with the puzzles. Now, two quick hot takes on that. One, this was definitely the first place that 8-year-old Jason encountered the word insipid. And second, as I played through the game, I wasn't sure that I agreed about the atrocious vocabulary. Now, this is a game that in that instruction manual, they gave kind of that, 3-column little breakdown of these are the kinds of words you might need to know. And you can see some verbs kind of like, okay, I'll put that verb in my back pocket and think about it. But I didn't find that there were things that I found difficult to express. Did you?
I found in particular there is a point where you need to turn a valve. And there's a whole elaborate situation where you need to cut off a piece of some suet or some grease or something and melt it in a
Oh,
flask.
yeah.
And that's an elaborate puzzle. You spend a lot of time doing it. And then you've got this molten grease. And then what verb do you use to oil or to lubricate this valve? Because in the example list of verbs, there aren't any that seem that appropriate. And I will confess I did not try use, just because that's my bias in having come from the Infocom world.
Sure.
Use verbs tend to be, you get a lecture on Infocom land for that.
Right.
But I ultimately tried the word grease as a verb and it worked.
Okay. Yeah, that one I had overlooked. But yeah, overall, like I felt like the when it was describing something, it made sense. You usually got a
Yeah.
description. If you looked in objecting and infocom bias, we would think of examine, but in this game, look,
Look.
applies to
Yeah.
both. Um, it's definitely it is unapologetic about that gore. As Nick already mentioned very early on, you get descriptions of wriggling maggots, and yeah, what Kim Shuet is saying there is certainly true. There's a lot of blood and gore. I did kind of feel like the game was trying to have it both ways. That on the one hand, it felt like we were perhaps in a long lost tomb, but then there was also lots of descriptions of like, and there's fresh blood, and it looks like there's
Yes.
just been a massacre. And I'm like, so who and where are all these other people that are disappearing here? So I felt like it was trying to play both sides of it on that front. It
Yeah.
has tough inventory management with a limit of 6 items, sometimes less than that. Sorry, Nick, you were about to say something.
Well, I was just going to say that in terms of the setting, it's supposed to be the Crypt of Medea. Now, Medea is from Greek myth. She is the wife of Jason and the Argonauts. And yeah, she's part of a tradition of sort of grisly horror in that in the story, she murders her own children. She does so for political reasons I don't recall, but it's definitely a moment that's played up for its shock value now and again. And that's supposed to be who Medea is. I don't feel like I got any sense of why Medea was chosen as the theme for this beyond perhaps that link. Yeah, it did very much seem like you went from a mausoleum to a sort of, I guess a murder hospital of sorts, and then you were through all sorts of other different locations, underground caves, the usual things, mines, that sort of thing. Very traditional adventure fare, but it did seem like a very strange thing that you would find yourself, in this crypt that happened to have a room with collapsing trash compactor spikes.
Yeah, and it may be a thing. I wonder if they kind of backed into it from the badass painting on the cover of the game, which is certainly memorable. And that
Yes.
alone, I have to feel sold some copies, which again raises my question of why this game never ended up on other platforms. And I do wonder if it was something that maybe they found distributors were a little reluctant to handle, or there were just enough early reviews that because what contemporary reviews there were pretty middling, not all quite as critical as Book of Adventure games, but people weren't completely blown away. But it still surprised me, in an era where you had these other platforms, that this was an Apple II exclusive. That said, I found the play experience. This is a game that the Apple II community has actually done quite a bit of work to try to preserve. The initial, it was one of those things where the initial pirated copies floating around turned out to have a game-breaking, whether it was a copy protection check or just a bad read was a little unclear. But there was a fixed-up version that came out in 2011. I'm sorry, 2001, and since then the preservation community has come up with completely pristine originals that are also playable, which was what I used, the WAS file, as they're called, the pristine original. Yeah, I don't know. It's a game that if you were paying the full price of $40 in 1983 money, maybe you'd find it a little wanting, but as something to go back to nowadays, full of blood and gore, yes, but I thought that it acquitted itself maybe better than the writers at the time recalled it. How'd you find it, Nick?
I felt, again, I haven't done too much on an Apple II in the past. Although I will say that I did first play Zork on an Apple II at the Seattle Public Library as a kid. And I think my impression of the Apple II is that it's such a limited platform in terms of, it was the first one to have color graphics in the home. But I think it was always one where you really had to push toward the corners of the machine to really get it to do things. And I felt somewhat impressed. This beat my expectations for what was capable on the platform, in that we had reasonably quick full screen graphics compared to what I was expecting. And then it also, it was able to, because it would display a backdrop, and then it would display items, sometimes in particular locations, to maybe change the effect of something in a room. And it would also just sort of display all of the items you dropped in the room. And I think that, on such a limited machine, it was pretty good at doing all of that. Sometimes the objects you dropped would appear all over the place, and you could have some funny effects if you tried dropping everything in one room.
Yeah.
But I also thought that I think it probably what charmed me most about it was some of the text effects with the game.
Yes.
And I think again, if I'm playing this and I'm taking this home and I've paid my $40 for it, I think I might spend more time thinking to myself back in the 80s. I might spend more time sitting back and just sitting with some of the visual effects, and sort of, maybe not feeling too upset that I have to keep doing this long animation to get back and forth between these rooms, because I feel like I'm interacting with the computer late at night, and I'm getting my money out of the machine, if nothing else. But no, the text effects, I think, were what really charmed me. In particular, there's one where you're swinging across a chasm and it plays George of the Jungle.
Yeah.
And if you're too heavy for the rope, it gets about halfway through the song, and then a whistle as you plummet to your death, which I thought was cute. And then there's an explosion where they do a really good job of making the entire wall of text sort of collapse to the bottom of the screen, to indicate that you've caused a cave in.
Yeah, and I was impressed by that. I was like, okay, they sat down and wanted to, entertain and amuse beyond just here are the puzzles that we've created and set down for you, which you know, and we'll talk about this when we get to lurking horror, but sometimes those Infocom guys would say, "Well, we have designed some mechanical engineering puzzles for you, and we think that that will definitely satisfy you. We've put
Yeah,
some adjectives and and a variety of verbs around them, and we think that this is the kind of thing that you like." But within the world of the game itself, sometimes they wouldn't put on those little flourishes.
right.
So yeah, the falling text, the spelling out of Geronimo as you swing across, those caught my attention. Some other quirks that I'd noticed: the score is quoted in experience points as though there are going to be skills or leveling or further adventures, but that doesn't really appear to have been part of the design at all. So maybe just crossing the streams a little bit. They were playing D&D at the time. The inverse text to show the direction that you just came
Yes,
from. It's a game that shows the visible exits, and yeah, the inverse text to show the room you came from. I thought it was good. I didn't
it's a
dislike
good
it.
feature.
They did let you turn it off. The timed input. I did carefully look over the manual for this. There's a puzzle at the end where timed input matters, and I always feel that's a little unfair, especially if you haven't set that expectation. It being set in a murder hospital, as you put it, maybe you give them a little slack there. I didn't think that was super cool, but since it was a game that had already showed they were willing to play with the format a bit, I guess it wasn't completely out of left field.
Yeah, I think both the timed puzzle toward the end and also there were some sort of dead man walking situations you would get yourself into regarding things like the candle.
Oh yeah.
And that was something where I realized after, banging up against a few of those toward the beginning, I realized I needed to make prodigious use of all 10 save slots, or I guess it was 9 save slots. So I have some notes over what exactly is going on in each save slot because I definitely found myself getting most of the way to the end and then realizing I had no way of creating light anymore or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Other things for the time. It does not have a maze. The map is relatively small without feeling tiny. Good array of puzzles, and yeah, for me, I think it's a game worth checking out. Obviously, if you are somebody who, and I'm fairly lily-livered as these things go, but I was able to, kind of maybe the time and distance and the Apple II-ishness of the graphics made me okay with it. But yeah, I was not too horrified by the horror. Nick, any final thoughts for you on the Crypt of Medea?
Yeah, I think the gore was relatively abstract. The imagery was great to have, a little bit cartoonish, which I think helped, like you said, kept me from feeling a little bit too squicked out. It was enjoyable. I definitely enjoyed it.
Trying something else a little different here on the Retro Adventurers, because the lurking horror, without flat out saying this is a world set in the Lovecraft mythos, nevertheless is steeped in the idea of being entertainment from that world of the particular New England monster madness. I decided to talk to an expert on the field, Chad Pfeiffer, who is the host of the Strange Studies of Strange Stories podcast, which started out devoted to Lovecraft. So he and I spoke about kind of the broader themes of how and why Lovecraft became a source of mainstream entertainment. So I'm going to share that interview with you now. Special segment here on the Retro Adventurers. Chad Pfeiffer from the podcast Strange Studies of Strange Stories is here, not to play the games, but to talk a little more broadly about kind of how the world of Lovecraft became a more mainstream source of fodder for entertainment. Chad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
And just to give everybody a little bit of background into Strange Studies of Strange Stories, I don't want to speak for it, but it started off as a heavily Lovecraftian podcast before moving on to other areas. But can you just give us a little bit of background on what you do and who you do it to?
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, we were called the H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast for 13 years and only just changed to the moniker Strange Studies of Strange Stories in the last couple of years. Although, to give you some background, around 2009, we started out the podcast with the mission of just covering Lovecraft's work. He had about 80 short stories, and we dedicated an episode to each of them where we would cut in guest readers, do a little scoring, and then discuss it. So it was a little bit of a hybrid adaptation, audio adaptation, and book club. We really enjoyed doing it, but we finished all his work by 2012. The lucky thing is, and we'll talk about this a bit with the gaming, he influenced so many writers and was influenced by so many writers that he worked into his fiction that we just started covering all of that stuff. So after 10 years of doing that, we thought, well, maybe we shouldn't call this H.P. Lovecraft Literary Podcast anymore, even though we talk about Lovecraftian things a lot. We cover all sorts of things. We've done, all the classic horror novels like Dracula and Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. We've covered all of H.G. Wells' work, as well as Beowulf and Wuthering Heights. Anything that has an element of weird fiction or horror to it, we've covered. And at this point, we're sort of rotating genres between fantasy, science fiction, and more traditional and weird horror.
The lurking horror is, itself, it's a niche of a niche. Even by the time it came out, there weren't, the gaming industry was moving past text-only adventures. But when I started digging into the history of it, it struck me that it really was kind of the first game of its type to be steeped in Lovecraftian mythos. And when we started to look at this, I was like, okay, what else was out there? Because the Lovecraft stories are from the early 20th century. But when did we
Yeah.
start seeing, for lack of a better term, things that were meant to be entertaining and fun, or at least something adjacent to fun? And there were some games, but not too many. The first edition of Arkham Horror, I found out, dates back to around 1980, and you've got the pen and paper games. But just to kind of back it up a little bit, when and how did the world of Lovecraft become something that got associated not just with the stories, but with something that was sort of more broadly entertaining and engaging and interactive fun?
Right. It's its own genre. So you hear that word Lovecraftian thrown around all the time. And in fact, it's a little like people aren't familiar with the source material, but they're familiar with some of the tropes. So folks would look at a Cthulhu plushie and kind of know that's from Lovecraft, the same way that folks kind of know who Conan the Barbarian is or Tarzan, but they haven't read those original stories, or Dracula even. So there's a pop culture aspect to Lovecraft now, but if you roll it all the way back to the beginning, there's a number of things that contribute to his worlds being good for games. And the first is probably that Lovecraft was sort of an internet guy before there was an internet.
Okay.
For those who don't know, Lovecraft was, as you say, a pioneer of science fiction and horror hybrid stories. His output was mostly in the 1920s and 1930s, mostly published in the pulp magazine Weird Tales. And his the concept of this author is him being this isolated figure huddled in his apartment in Providence, Rhode Island, scratching these things out, which is sort of true. But he was an intensely social person, albeit in a way that we would feel more familiar with in the modern day. His contacts were virtual. He wrote a lot of letters and was a correspondent with a ton of people. In fact, he wrote about 100,000 letters in his lifetime, second only to, I think, the French writer Voltaire in recorded correspondence. And he got his start in the amateur press, which were almost like self-published zines, working with other writers in a community, collaborating on different pieces. And he brought that collaborative spirit to his work in Weird Tales. The world, the mythos that he created, often called the Cthulhu mythos, it was open source. He didn't create a definitive framework for it. And he both allowed and encouraged other writers to work within it. And so you have his stories within the Cthulhu mythos, but he was also friends with Robert E. Howard, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, and Howard contributed stories to that world. He mentored a young, teenage Robert Bloch, later the author of Psycho, who contributed stories to that world. August Derleth was another friend who contributed stories, and he's from here, Sauk City, Wisconsin.
Yeah, I was going to mention Derleth as you were going down that list. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a really locally famous guy, and he opened Arkham House Publishing, which got Lovecraft into print, as well as a lot of writers like Ray Bradbury's first book. And Ray Bradbury contributed to the mythos, as did Stephen King later on. So authors who didn't even know him have all played on this playground. So that's factor one. There's a ton of source material from multiple authors that shape this world. It's not a rigid world, and you can participate in it as well. There's no canon. So that helps when you're creating these sort of open world games. Factor two is that this world is actually shaped by a point of view, which is cosmic horror. Traditional horror is shaped by a traditional morality. If you read Dracula, scary though it is, the cross can hurt Dracula. And Christian morality, if relied upon, ultimately will save the heroes. Reliance on God works, and if not that, reliance on the human spirit and human ingenuity works. We figure out the rules of the monster and its weakness, and we're able to admit our faults to each other, band together to defeat the forces of evil. But that's just not so with Lovecraft's work, in which humans are not the center of the universe. His story at the Mountains of Madness has a history of the universe, and it's clear that humanity is an accident, or if there is an intent, it's humorous. We were created as a joke. And there are centuries old hidden cults that worship these old gods that live in the earth, but the gods are really alien entities who don't care about us at all. Cthulhu, Lovecraft's most famous creation, is this kraken-like being that sleeps in the Pacific Ocean, has these tentacles on its face, immediately recognizable. If awoken, it will likely wreak havoc on Earth. But it's not like Godzilla, which is very similar, but is definitely reckoning with humanity's power in the atomic age. It's still about us. This creature has an intelligence and a biology and intentions that are completely incomprehensible to humanity. And I think that point of view, which is a little fatalistic, atheistic, it allows you to create a game that has character. It's not just a set of tropes. It's got a point of view. And I think the tropes are actually the third factor, which is what people would mostly know. You know, any game world has to have those recognizable things, Dungeons and Dragons, Ghostbusters, Star Wars, etc. Those are related to tics that Lovecraft had in his work, things that he put in play over and over. So there's going to be a scary book like the Necronomicon, which was his creation, and shows up in movies later like Evil Dead 2 or Evil Dead. There's going to be some monster that doesn't make sense to our puny human brain, something unnameable and incomprehensible that probably will have tentacles of some kind. And often characters will go insane, which could get them sent to Arkham Asylum, another Lovecraft creation. You know, the Batman Arkham Asylum is lifted from Lovecraft's work. And that's a gift to gaming, this second thing, this insanity mechanic, by the way. You know, most gaming is very binary. Your character gets killed. You know, that's what can happen. Your party gets killed. But in this type of world, there's this other kind of bad result. You can go insane, and that's got all kinds of interesting possibilities to it. Any Lovecraftian game is likely going to have some kind of insanity mechanic, like the role-playing game, the tabletop role-playing game, The Call of Cthulhu, that came out in the 80s. Speaking of Arkham, that was a town that was created in Massachusetts that was individual and unique to Lovecraft. Most people who write in that tradition create their own little towns. Again, great for game scenarios. He also created a seaport town called Innsmouth, you know, where the people are all deformed. Many of them are hybrid fish people. So, you know, you're going to have a lot of New England accents, a lot of people with bulgy eyes. Those are all tropes you're going to find in a Lovecraft world. That story, The Shadow over Innsmouth, deals with a tainted bloodline discovery. And one thing that people probably do know about Lovecraft these days is that he was a racist in his personal life. That bleeds through into a lot of his fiction. But sometimes he accidentally makes his own argument against himself, as in The Shadow over Innsmouth, when the lead person figures out, oh my gosh, I'm a fish man too, but this is actually kind of great. I'm going to go swim in the ocean. So it's got this like message of monstrous acceptance at the end of it, which is counter to how he believed in his personal life. So those are some of the basics of why I think it's a rife world for creating games.
Yeah, on the other hand, you know, as you were saying with the insanity mechanic and the, you know, there is no weakness that we can all band together and exploit to, you know, either defeat or at least you know, drive Godzilla back into the ocean or whatever. You know, the trope is pretty much you are going to lose,
Yes.
and that's an interesting area to build games around. On the one hand, you know, we have the now largely retired mechanic of, you know, the arcade game, which, you know, the goal is to take a quarter from you and then, you know, you lose, you know, a minute or two into it. So it feels like we kind of missed a lot of opportunities there to develop a Lovecraftian, you know, stand-up arcade games back when a game that beats you is the default. But yeah, like you mentioned, Dungeons and Dragons, and you know, certainly a lot of tabletop games where the idea, the dream, is that, or often a guarantee, you know, somebody's going to win a game of Monopoly. You know, if you
Right.
finish it, somebody's going to win a game of Clue. They're gonna, you know, come up with the weapon, you know, the place, and the killer. But a Lovecraftian game proceeds from the assumption that you are probably not going to achieve victory in the sense of we slay the dragon, we take the treasure home, and, you know, I don't know, we invest sensibly in long-term municipal bonds or however a D&D campaign ends. So
That's always the result. Yeah.
yeah. So how did those move into more mainstream acceptance? You know, I remember Call of Cthulhu when I first learned about it in my,
Mhm.
you know, young Jason playing D&D, you know, days in the 80s. You know,
Yeah.
it was again, you know, a niche of a niche. You know, not many guys were playing Call of Cthulhu, but I did
Right.
learn about the insanity mechanic. But is it through Stephen King and things like that, that the idea of if you just sort of barely survive the menace, then call yourself lucky,
Mhm.
as he became such a big deal, in books and in film as well. Is that how we get more people wanting to sit down and a round of Arkham Horror in which maybe one of us survives to the end? We'll call that a win. We'll call that a win for the team.
Yeah.
Is that how we get there?
Why is that even an attractive thing for you to do in a game? I think that gets to, why do we play games? And sure, I became aware of Lovecraft by my uncle had a book that had one of his stories in it, and I kind of read it, and it was fine. But it really was the role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu, that attracted me to it initially, and it was that you were probably going to die, and it was so fatalistic. And I think that you play some games for wish fulfillment, like a Dungeons and Dragons, because you want to be big and strong and beat up the bad guys and have fun with that sort of things that just can't happen in your real life. This appeals to, I think, a sense of mystery. It's the journey that you're on, In terms of like text-based games, I played Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy that on my Commodore 64 back in the day. And I liked doing that because I wanted to live in that world. I didn't really care if I was successful as much as I just wanted to be in the world of that book that I'd enjoyed. And I think
Mm.
there's an aspect of that here where, like I said, there's this huge world that's been created of hidden cults and secret books and weird monsters, and you just want to go live in it for a while. But you don't necessarily need to fulfill the wish of being powerful. You want to discover things. And I find that a lot of these stories, Alone in the Dark, a lot of games that have popped up out of this, because they're not all necessarily based on his work, but on the idea that you're trying to uncover a mystery and it just gets more and more horrible as you go.
Yeah, and Alone in the Dark,
It
certainly, right.
penetrates internet culture, certainly with creepypasta and that sort of thing. And I think that in games, it's just a second kind of game to play. So when the folks that played Lovecraft-based games often enjoy the experience and don't necessarily need to win.
Yeah. And is it that maybe it's a little bit easier when you can connect and communicate in a global community to kind of bring things back into the fore, like the Arkham Horror board game, which again I was mildly surprised to learn its first edition was around 1980, but then it,
Yeah, I
it
didn't know
was
that.
part of that renaissance in the late 90s of fancy elaborate board games,
Yeah.
coming into the fore. Is it the idea that you can connect and find that bigger community of people that don't mind a game that ends in futility and devastation?
A lot of the people who listen to our show and start learning about the fiction came in through Arkham Horror. They were playing the board game, and something about the texture of it really appealed to them. The story texture of it, the tropes. They wanted to learn more. Where does this all come from? Some people come in from listening to Metallica. Some people come in from, watching Evil Dead. There's a lot of portals into that fiction. But certainly the bit of fatalism and the mystery is just fun. It's just fun knowing ultimately your choices don't matter. There's something about that that's just a fun way to play a game.
Something freeing, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and like I was saying, Lurking Horror not being an officially licensed, work of that world, you have to go a
Hmm.
little bit later to start getting those licensed works. But it is one of the first from the first, call it 15 years or so, going back to the university mainframe games, where you can really identify that kind of influence on it. There were
Yeah.
other horror games, but those tended to be rooted in, say like Greco-Roman myth. Crypt of Medea was kind of the first horror game that I remember learning about.
Hmm.
There's Cranston Manor that kind of deals with what would more broadly be thought of as
Fun.
the occult in that 19th century. Strange things are going on in this Victorian village kind of feel. And I've never been able to pin down exactly what took that amount of time, for it to surface, in much the same way that I've always been really surprised that it took a long time before you start seeing more than one or two games that are based on the works of Shakespeare to come about. I've always been
Hmm.
surprised because it's as public domain properties with brand value are concerned, it seemed like a good one, but just didn't really get there.
Yeah.
Is there anything that you see that kind of makes that early era of computing, other than just it was a relatively small number of people who were designing these games at the time? What took it, what took it so long to really spark and become something that people would say, yes, not only do I want to play this game, but I want to pay money to play a game that's set in this world.
I think, well, Lovecraft wasn't famous in his lifetime. He died obscure in his work. had little surges of popularity here and there, but were mostly very esoteric. And he had a little bit of renaissance in the 80s when enough individuals had read his work. And Stephen King actually helped a lot as well, just by commenting on the fact that he was influenced by Lovecraft. So probably the game started before his popularity increased. But he was a real sucker for classical mythology, so he would have really liked that Greek myth game, actually. A lot of his works work within the mainframe of the morality of a classical society. But I just think it took some time for that to catch up, and definitely the Call of Cthulhu tabletop role playing game helped.
Yeah, and I don't have much context on the evolution of Call of Cthulhu, but I know like a lot of the systems that have survived over the decades, it's had a number of updates. Is there something about it that you've seen in how they've updated and modernized the system that reflects the growing popularity or even the just the growing amount of media that's in the Lovecraft inspired universe?
The game is still doing really well, and I think it's the second most played role playing game after Dungeons and Dragons. So I think people get comfortable with that type of gameplay, and then they want to see what else is out there. And it's been such a consistent product for so long that it gets snapped up. I still, if I were to play it, I would probably play the old rules from the 90s when I was in high school and playing it. I don't know much about how the rule system has been updated, but it is simple enough to learn. I'm not really a crunchy numbers type of person with games. And so I do appreciate that Chaosium, that's the publisher of the game, they use a percentile system. So it's very easy to understand when you're successful at something or when you're not. If you get over 40% or under, 40%, it's very easy for somebody to entry level play that game. And in fact, I played that before I played Dungeons and Dragons and those kinds of things. So I think that the ease of the system also helped with the popularity of it. Yeah. But there's also, I mean, Guillermo del Toro's got Cabinet of Curiosities on Netflix. There's a general awareness of that genre now that didn't used to exist. That also
Any,
helps those games.
yeah. Are there any frontiers in VR and augmented reality and beyond that you're tracking as a student of Lovecraft and the mythos?
I mean, people are constantly telling me about these things. I don't game much anymore, but I know that Bloodborne is a game that's on the PS4 that people absolutely love and is said to be, the most Lovecraftian video game, even though it's not really officially connected to that universe. But once again, it's an open source thing, so it doesn't really matter. So Bloodborne, I know that's one you got to check out. For me, that's a little too hard. I tried to start playing it, I couldn't get through it. There are a lot of examples in VR. I mean, this has penetrated every segment of the gaming industry, card games, you name it. It's just a world that people want to return to again and again because they love the mystery of it. They love the cults. They love the monsters. And they love that fatalistic streak of it.
And you'd mentioned Robert E. Howard and works of Conan, and I know just
Hmm.
from tracking, what is and is not in the public domain that there's these weird loopholes where like certain Conan stories that didn't get dug up until the 60s or 70s, they're under
Right.
copyright forever. Is there any kind of great white whale sitting out there of well you can get Cthulhu, but you can't get these other things until they go public domain in the 2030s. Is there a next wave of property to be unlocked in that way?
I wonder about it, and because on our show we actually don't cover any living authors. It's not a modern review show. We only talk. Unfortunately, you have to die to get into the club of authors that we cover. So we are frequently doing stuff that's from I don't know what it is now. It's maybe 1928. Everything before that is public domain, and there are a lot of
Usually,
things
yeah.
that pop up, and I think, oh yeah, this would be great. There's a lot of ghost hunter characters that were very popular, like Karnaki the Ghost Finder. And I wonder when is there going to be a Karnaki project? We're actually going to publish an anthology of public domain stories, probably at the beginning of next year, that will have lots of characters like that, so people can keep their eye out for that to see if they're interested in any of them. I would love there to be a Robert E. Howard Conan series that follows that character as written in the short stories because it's actually philosophically really interesting work aside from the adventure stuff. I like the Schwarzenegger movie, but past that, nobody's really done it justice yet, I don't think. Those are really interesting things. But yes, there is a lot more out there besides Dracula, Sherlock Holmes. I mean, there are other characters from the public domain era that I don't see a next wave coming necessarily, but I'm certainly always thinking about it.
All right. And to keep up on that public domain collection you were talking about and other
Mhm.
developments, where should people follow you?
StrangeStudies.com is a great place to go. We're on Patreon, and we put out about 5 shows a month. That's 3 story shows and a feedback and extra credit show. We just did an extra credit show on the film Suitable Flesh, which is a retelling of The Thing on the Doorstep, a Lovecraft story with Heather Graham in it that came out a couple of years ago. And this reminded me why we only cover non-living authors, because on our extra credit, we'll talk about movies and that kind of thing. And we talked about the movie and then tweeted about the episode. This was just the other day. And the director of the movie was like, I cannot wait to listen. Uh-oh, I did not say nice things about that movie. I
I
don't
was just
ever
about to
want
say,
that to happen.
I was just about to say, did you wait until the director had died? And there was my answer.
Nope. Mm-mm. No, he's around. He's a young guy. And apparently, if he listens to the episode, it's going to think I'm an asshole. But the thing is, I I just didn't think we were popular enough for it to get out. But it's so hard to make a film. It's so hard to write a book. It's so hard to do a play or a novel or anything that I just personally really don't like crapping on anybody's output. It's for me or it's not for me. You know what I mean? And so I just really don't like doing that. So I was a little ashamed that the director was going to hear me complain about his film. But the thing is Lovecraft is notoriously difficult to adapt. And as a result, a lot of the films aren't that fantastic. Although there are some from the 80s, like Reanimator. I don't know if you've ever seen that one.
I am
Uh,
far, far too lily-livered for Reanimator, but I am aware of the premise.
yeah, that was directed by Stuart Gordon, who unfortunately passed away not that long ago. But he made a few Lovecraft adaptations and actually was one of the founders of a theater company here in Madison on his
Yeah.
way through.
Yeah.
And he was somebody I got to hang out with here and there in Los Angeles and a good friend. Suitable Flesh was in the spirit of his films. So those are pretty good. But other than that, there's an entity called the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society in Los Angeles, which I work with here and there. And we made in 2005 an adaptation of Lovecraft's most famous story, The Call of Cthulhu, that was made as if it were made at the time the story was written in the 20s. So it's a silent film with stop motion monster in it. And that's been on DVD for quite some time, but it wasn't in the streaming world because of various distribution rights until just recently. It's now on Tubi, the streaming service, as well as a second film called The Whisperer in Darkness. So if you're curious about Lovecraft stuff, go to Tubi and check out The Call of Cthulhu. I'm in it. Much younger version of me anyway.
So we've got Tubi, we've got strangestudies.com, right?
That's right. Mhm.
Strangestudies.com and the podcast. Chad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate you letting me blab for so long.
And that was Chad Pfeiffer of the Strange Studies of Strange Stories podcast. Nick, did you have any takeaways from my chat with Chad?
Well, I think I'm definitely going to subscribe to this podcast. That was fantastic. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing just how influential Lovecraft was. And I think, it was touched on that he wasn't perhaps the sort of person you'd want to have over to a party these days. But it's kind of amazing that the Lovecraftian literature these days is full of people trying to either do redemptive readings or to, come up with their own approaches that kind of, take what they love from it and leave what they don't like.
So moving on to our main course, The Lurking Horror, a 1987 Infocom title, which puts it relatively late in the run. Published by Infocom on DOS, Amiga, Atari ST, Macintosh, the sort of 16-bit platforms of the day, and then Amstrad, Apple II, Commodore 64, and significantly Atari 8-bit. And this last decision seems to have led to material being cut. There was quite a bit of reading out there about Dave Lebling's design notes, things that he said about the game, ambitions that he had for it that later had to be shelved because of all the early 8-bit platforms. The Atari's standard floppy size was the smallest. It was about 90K on a side. So apart from the limitations of the kind of first gen version 3 of the Z machine that this was written in, it also had to fit all of that random access material on one Atari 8-bit disk side. And I felt that this really showed early on. But before we get too far in that, Nick, when you first started talking about your experiences with the Commodore 128, with Bureaucracy, that being kind of your first introduction to the world of Infocom and what comes in the box, the browsy, that you mentioned, the feelies. What's been your kind of history of engaging with what comes in the Infocom experience and how that mapped to this game?
This game, like you said, it was late. This is after the Activision purchase, I believe, of Infocom. So this is, they were already cutting back on some of the more extravagant feelies in the big gray box sets. So I remember, for example, the Hitchhiker's Guide had all sorts of lovely little funny things in it. The peril-sensitive sunglasses that were just a piece of black cardboard.
Hmm.
The microscopic space fleet that was just an empty plastic bag, etc.,
Don't
etc.
panic button. Yep.
The Don't Panic badge, the whole bit. All sorts of stuff that came with these. And if you think back to their early releases, one of Liebling's own games, Starcross, originally came in a sort of funny pie tin floating saucer that software houses of the day, the retail shops loved them because they were eye-catching, but they hated them because there was no place to put them on the shelves,
Right.
and you had to dust them rather aggressively to keep them from looking a bit grotty. Yeah, so this was cut down. This is toward the end when there's basically, it seems like their budget is limited to printed materials. That said, the stuff they included here, because the setting here is a sort of MIT with only some of the serial numbers filed off.
Right.
This is probably about 10 years after when the original Zork was written on the mainframe. That was sort of a late 70s project.
Yep.
And they left to form Infocom starting around 79. So this would have been sort of a love letter to his misspent youth at MIT. And so the materials are like a student ID card, and then a sort of a fresher's welcome magazine. As though, you were a freshman just just joined this university. I believe it's called, what was the name that they chose for it? It was
The George Underwood Edwards Institute
George
of Technology.
Underwood Edwards.
Yes.
I don't know if this is a reference to anyone in particular.
I think they're bacronyming GUE, Great
GUE.
Underground Empire.
Yes, exactly. I think so. There are references, however, in particular when you look at the pediment over the doorway to there's George Edwards is credited, and then Lebling is credited as the architect, and then there's someone who's credited for acoustics or something for the sound design. But anyway, so that you've got this university which is clearly MIT. It's laid out like MIT. It has a dome like MIT. It has an infinite corridor like MIT. You get the map inside. You look at that. You go, that is the MIT campus. I felt like this was amazing. It actually had photographs of the dome of MIT inside the leaflet. Like it was clearly, I think, some stock footage of MIT. So lest anybody have any misgivings about this game is basically set at MIT.
Yeah.
And I think that for the limited budget, that pamphlet, that leaflet, the card, the basic stuff that came with it, I think was pretty effective. I don't actually remember these from when I originally played it. I don't remember if I had the gray box or if I had the cheaper folio of this, which was a format that Infocom printed that was sort of a lower cost version of some of their classic games, where it would only have what's called the browsy, which is just the manual. And I can't recall if that was what we had as in the 80s, but that I do remember playing this game on the Commodore and having trouble with it.
Yeah, I pulled out my copy because in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, when online auctions were in their heyday and postage was cheap and people were getting rid of their stuff, I tried to make it a point to acquire all of the original Infocom games in the original packaging. And so I pulled my copy of Lurking Horror to look through it and found to my dismay, who knows if I knew this when I bought it, 20 years ago or whatever. But it did not have that freshman, unofficial guide in it, nor did it have the surprise feelie, which was not pictured on the packaging of the plastic centipede.
Yes.
So yeah, and I know that somewhere I have, because at some point I bought a lot of, just kind of a lot of random Infocom feelies, and it might, I'm wondering if the GUE guide is in there, but never had the centipede. So too bad, so sad for me now, because I'm not going to go out and acquire these at 2024 prices.
I read somewhere that not all boxes got the centipede.
Oh, okay. Well, the
I'd have
fact
to
that
look
I'm
that
missing
up,
the GUE guide makes me, suspect that whatever else was missing is also missing. But okay, that would make sense that would be another cost-cutting measure, and also not confusing people with the even wrapped in plastic. I'm sure it'd be a little unsettling to people, which of course is the point. The point of being in this world is to be unsettled.
Did you have the ID card?
Yes, my box did have the ID card, which of course is one of those documentation copy protection items
Yeah.
early on. You need to input your username and password. The ID is on the student ID card, and the password is scribbled in the GUI guide, and kind of the take your own notes here, write down your class schedule kind of thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it yeah, as I think you alluded about the sound design, much like Crypt of Medea, this was a game, and it's interesting how we see this in all sorts of genre. As the horror film was kind of the monster movie was kind of petering out in the 50s. You get these producers and exhibitors that say, well, what if we add smells to it? What if we electrify the seats? What if we add another sensory level to this experience you've already had? And the lurking horror, at least on some platforms, had the sound pack. Now, I will
Yes.
admit that I have been spoiled by relying on the Internet Archive to provide easy access to emulated machines. And as we record this, we are coming out of the period when the archive was completely down, but we are still in the period where a lot of stuff just doesn't work. Search doesn't work in the arc, not on the Wayback Machine, but in the general archives. Search doesn't work, and neither do the emulators. So I was not able to find the time to spin up my own Amiga emulator and experience the sounds. How did you play it?
Well, I am a Linux user, so I was a little bit more like the hacker in this story in that I was, blazing over the keys. I did everything within a terminal in Frotz, which is one of the more modern, zip
Interpreters, yeah.
interpreters. Yeah.
Yeah, as I was listing out all the games that Lurking Horror was originally supported on, of course, today it is playable on virtually every device that turns on. There's probably somebody who's hacked it into an electric toothbrush at this point because of things like Frotz and all those
Yeah.
interpreters that can be run on very little hardware indeed.
Yeah.
Does it run Doom? But we who have been around a long time know that the real question is, does it run Zork?
Exactly. And unfortunately, I was not. I faffed a little bit with the blorb file that contains the sounds to try and get it hooked up because it's sort of a bag on the side of the game. Your interpreter basically gets a signal from the game that says, open up whatever your Because again, these had to work on, like you said, the Atari ST and the Amiga and the Macintosh and all these other machines. And so not all of them had the same sound capabilities. And so I believe most of the sounds that we have archived are from the Amiga version.
Yeah,
Although I may
and
be
and
wrong about that.
yeah, I believe that it was the Amiga version that had the
Yeah.
sounds, and not just the sound capabilities, but also just the storage. This, of course, being well before we had MP3 or other deep and lossy compression formats. So those samples for those of us who were customizing our machines in the late 80s, early 90s, those that could play customized sounds, that was a real allocation of space when you needed to do that, and to get any kind of fidelity. So yeah, each of those little sound clips, is 40, 50K, and that adds up. So yeah, the Amiga disk format, among other things, just gave them the space to be able to do that. But
Yeah. And
oh, go ahead.
well, I was going to say that, and my understanding is that these sounds are relatively short. They're
Yeah,
basically stings and creaks and short atmospheric moments rather than an actual soundscape being delivered to you. And again, as with the Apple II, I think if you had an Amiga at this time and you played this game and you got a creaking door or a shriek or whatever it was that came out of your speakers, I think you would feel at that time that you had sort of gotten your money's worth of going for this on the Amiga rather than on a lesser platform.
yeah, yeah. I definitely see where it would have perked things up, and definitely if you were buying it on something that had been touted as a multimedia machine, in the late 80s, you'd be happy to get it. But did not seem to be essential to the gameplay, and
No,
neither of us made the sound work. Let's put it that way.
it's true.
So something I want to talk about before we delve into the game itself is that this is pitched as Infocom's one and only official horror title. But as I sat down and thought about that, I'm like, Suspended is really horrifying. And you just mentioned those early packaging, the Star-Crossed saucer, and of course the
Mhm.
infamous suspended mask, which terrified me up on the shelves there. And when you delve into the world of Suspended, this dystopia in which somebody is selected at random to have their brain hooked up to computers, for 1,000 years, like It's super horrifying. So I'm not
Yeah.
sure I agree that the lurking, and of course, what's going on in the world of Suspended is people are, being flung off, moving walkways and, killed in earthquakes. Like there's a lot of horror there. It's presented differently, but yeah, how did you find the idea that this is Infocom's, first and only official foray into horror?
I'm going to embarrass myself and ask you, was Suspended a leveling title?
No, no, that was Michael Berlin,
That
who
was Michael Berlin,
that
right?
dude could
Yeah.
write, and
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
going to come back to that actually, and I
That's
and I want to do a Berlin retrospective. He passed away recently, and I think that
right.
that he's kind of underappreciated for being a guy who came from a literary background. He has several published novels, and what he did with the format, even compared to other Infocom titles, and
Mm,
Suspended, the kind of world that he built with a
yeah.
wry dystopian twist, sets him apart from some. But no, that was Mike Berlin.
Yeah, Mike Berlin. Okay. Yeah, I think this was, I think this is the first, this is a post Ghostbusters, if you want to think of that as a barrier between,
Okay.
the past and the future. This is definitely, modern cinematic, approach to things where you're saying, and again, Lebling also from Zork wants to take elements and mix them together, right? He wants to have, a dungeon crawl where you run across a big industrial dam over in Zork and all these other elements kind of get mixed together. He wants wizards mixed up with, technology and all this stuff. And I think, he manages, I think, to sell it a little bit better in this one. There's a lot more existential horror, but there's also, this, is it a rope? Is it a chain? Is it a network cable kind of stuff going on in here? That I think is unique. And I think there's a bunch of firsts that this could claim, but I don't know if it's necessarily the first horror.
Yeah. Yeah. So we find ourselves, like you said, we're an MIT slash GUE student trying to finish a rapidly overdue and far too long term paper, and horror ensues. Along
Yeah.
the way, there is a detailed microwave oven simulator.
Oh, yes.
There's an elaborate mechanical engineering puzzle involving an elevator. There are some interesting and graphic and detailed deaths.
Yeah.
But I have to say that the lack of space hit me really early on. It hit me in the very first room, the computer lab, which is described as having banners and signs posted up. And when you type read banner or read sign, it returns a default. How do you do that with a sign? And I said, oh no, I can see where we had to cut some corners here.
Yes. And this also, again, this is another game where it's not time based, but there is a section toward the end where you have a limited number of moves. And running across parser problems like that really cost you. You really only have a budget of so many turns to do what it is you need to do. And when you find yourself, getting into semantic arguments with the parser about whether something is a cable or a line or a whatever, it can really, cause you to have to roll back to an earlier save.
So early on, I thought that the writing overall, when corners weren't being cut, was effective.
Mm-hmm.
As you drift off into the first kind of disrupted, dream hallucination state. Of course, we could question whether this whole episode was a dream or hallucination of some sort. But when you are whisked away from the computer terminal to the location place, and the description begins. This is a place. And my reaction that I
Yeah.
wrote as I was playing was, not everybody can get away with that kind of writing, but I do think that Lebling pulled it off here. How did you feel about that crossover between the world of the somewhat askew GUE? I mean, it is described as having a department of alchemy, so we already
Yes.
know that we are in something that's adjacent to the real world, but not the world as we know it. Dates are presented as though they are our dates. We see
Mm-hmm.
that the pizza place was founded in 1956 or whatever, but they think it's a different 1956 pizza place than we would have in our world if a department of alchemy in fact exists on campus. So how did you feel about the way that he sort of introduced those elements of here's both the other that exists in the daytime world, what this character would see as the real world, and then the world where you think it's a rope but it's a tentacle, and now there's a pentagram and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things that I found striking playing through this game now as an adult is that I saw it much more as an unreliable narrator. I mean, Hitchhiker's Guide famously told itself that it lied to you, but it was always a bald-faced lie that it confessed to very quickly. Whereas I feel like I made it all the way through this game again, and I never really was entirely certain that this wasn't, let's say, a nightmare that the character falls into upon seeing the document missing, or perhaps this dangerous experience of reading whatever digital Necronomicon-style text has had on him or her, if that's, causing the perception that we're experiencing through the game. I think it really... There's a whole lot of ambiguous sensory experience, as you said, where, you're not quite sure what you see out of the corner of your eye. Things can mean multiple things. Characters turn out to be more than they seem. I think it's entirely possible within the story itself to read it as you are a character who is experiencing perhaps madness in an ordinary world.
Yeah, and I think that to the extent I am not a big Lovecraft reader, as mentioned earlier, kind of lily livered, don't enjoy particularly going in for things that are going to horrify me and keep me up at night. But my understanding, to back up, is that a lot of the Lovecraftian genre is you barely survive this extremely unsettling experience and nobody will believe you.
Yes, that is absolutely it. And I think loneliness and being unable to communicate this unique experience is probably where the real horror in Lovecraftian stories, either the originals or those written by fans later on. I think that is what really gets to me, is this sense that someone has been through something and really cannot communicate it to everyday people around them. You mentioned that it wasn't explicitly described as a Lovecraftian story. However, there is a moment very early on when you ask the hacker to try and solve your problem with the PC. He says, "Oh, it looks like it was mixed up with the file server with some files from the Department of Alchemy." He grunts. "People's names for their nodes are getting weird. This one is called Lovecraft." Then tells you your paper is gone. Yeah,
I was surprised by how on the nose that reference was actually. And I, in retrospect, and I will take a moment to look it up right now because I want to be clear about this. Yeah, they do actually on the back cover say the lurking horror recalls the ghastly visions of H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King, and the latter surprised me because that was a living author, and I do wonder if either the legal department was it's fair game enough to say it's in the style of without implying that it's without implying authorship or endorsement, or maybe fellow New Englanders they worked something out. I'm really not sure. There's definitely a lot that you could get away with in 80s video game marketing that you can't today, just because more money is involved. But yeah, as much as it, I guess on the front cover didn't expressly say this is going to be about Cthulhu. It's a rather generic sort of skeleton skull image rather than the kind of tentacle monster thing that maybe today would be more recognizable as part of the Lovecraftian mythos. And maybe it's a missed opportunity to appeal to people that already were playing Call of Cthulhu or first wave Arkham horror or things like that. But they definitely did. You're right. They salted some of those reminders in there of what kind of world, what kind of influences there were.
The one thing I think that they did explicitly tag, which I wasn't as aware of when I was younger, is there's a lot of elements to this game that are explicitly from MIT hacker culture.
Yes.
So if you've ever read Stephen Levy's Hackers or The Jargon File was a famous text file that circulated around the internet of just the lingo of this culture of people at MIT in the 60s and 70s. And the hacker uses a lot of this lingo. So he'll talk about, data getting corrupted. He'll call it chomping, or he'll call people he doesn't like chompers. And that was just a term that came from this file. But there are a lot of other references. So, for example, the MIT hackers famously they would hack computers. They would come up with clever solutions to things. They would find ways to explore in places that were difficult. And they would also call, sort of what we might today call LARPing, exploring in the steam tunnels beneath the MIT campus as hacking. And as a matter of fact, there's a game that's very famous. It's sort of a roguelike called NetHack that I think a lot of people in my generation downloaded expecting it to be a sort of cyberpunk netrunner kind of story. But no, it was actually just a tunnel hacking game, as in D&D,
sure.
that was distributed over the internet and developed over the internet. And so that was why it had that name. And so the fact that the actual steam tunnels underneath MIT are represented here and are essential to the story, and also references to things like some of the elevator hacking and elevator surfing that was, it's described in the jargon file exactly how to do it, or at least I think it's alluded to. This notion that you can wedge the doors open and you can do things like getting on the top of a lift, or you can, get it to go where it's not expected to go. That's actually something that's explicitly covered in the jargon file.
Interesting. Yeah, when I was encountering that puzzle, I was thinking of my mind goes to the James Bond movie View to a Kill that has some elevator hacking as they're escaping the burning building. But yeah, I did not realize that the jargon file would have essentially clues to solve those puzzles. I think also in the GUE guide,
Yes.
there's a mention. I think in Hackers, the idea of asking questions in Lisp format, food P.
Yes.
I mean, do you want food? I think I first read that in Hackers, so it was interesting to see that crop up here as well. And a reminder as well, which we've talked about in the Retro Adventures and will continue to. These early text adventures kind of come out of a few pockets of cultural influence. You've got the MIT crowd that goes to Infocom. You've got the West Coast crowd that kind of clustered around Sierra and those types. A couple pockets in the UK, and if they things that they were interested in are reflected in a lot of games. Things they were not interested in, you go like, why did nobody make the thing I keep bringing up? Why did nobody make a Shakespeare game? The answer, because none of these 5 pockets of influence particularly wanted to.
Right.
They wanted to do games about steam tunnels and elevator hacking and really elaborate microwave simulators.
Yes.
For a game that was space constrained, the realistic depiction of punching numbers into the microwave, complete with, I don't know if you tried this. I tried to microwave a bunch of different stuff and I didn't really get the types of interesting results I wanted. Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders did it better when you had to microwave an egg, because like you microwave the Coke and nothing particularly happens.
Yeah.
But you could enter times in the microwave either by punching each number out, and the number would, move along like you would expect, from single seconds to tens of seconds to minutes, or you could type like set timer to 400 and it would convert that 400 seconds into minutes and seconds. So like there's a lot of code in there to simulate something that's mostly just used for one thing. It doesn't seem to have a lot of other, if there were other objects later on that I should have popped in there, I missed the opportunity. But like I microwaved the stone, nothing seemed to happen. Microwave the Coke, nothing seemed to happen. Yeah, a loving microwave simulator.
Yes. And I will confess, the only thing I really tried to microwave that I shouldn't was I got so frustrated trying to find the urchin when I needed to, that I ended up going up there and trying to microwave the hand. I was so frustrated. And unfortunately, if you try that, he jumps to your other shour and avoids your grasp.
Oh, okay. But it is
senses
accounted for. Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
That's cool. I assumed it would have been, but I didn't try it.
Yeah. So on the subject of MIT with the serial numbers filed off, there is an animal on the ring for the hand, and I believe it's called a Hyrax.
Yes.
This is a reference to the beaver on the class ring at MIT. I had a friend who had one, and she always, she was proudly showing it off, and she apparently there's all sorts of lingo around it, which way the beaver is facing and that sort of thing. But that's a reference to the actual MIT class ring, and you just know that Lebling was typing in the code for this game with that ring on.
Yeah, it must have been. Yeah, and that. Speaking of dictionary words to look up, and I'm like, this is a rabbit. What are we talking about? So that really helps. But oh boy, if you were not,
Hyrax is like a marmot basically. It's one of those rodent-like animals. I don't think it's actually a rodent, but it's one of those small furry animals. It's about the size of a small beaver.
So yeah, we talked about the Department of Alchemy being a real place, reminding us that we're not quite in the real world. Dangerous subterranean janitors, those could
Yeah,
exist in the real world,
sure. Why
I
not?
suppose. But yeah, that idea of like you said, the unreliable narrator. Are we just a freshman having a meltdown, or are these things actually happening? Has the janitor been subverted? Are the urchins really more menacing than usual?
Or is Lebling even just recalling, a time when he was hiding around in the tunnels and have had to run away from actual janitors, and he and his friends spun it into a more fantastic story.
Yeah. Yeah, and then we threw the axe at the power cord.
Exactly. The motto on the seal for the GUE is Omne ignotum pro magnifico, which I believe is roughly "to the great goes all of the unknown,"
Ooh.
which doesn't mean very much as far as I can tell, but
But feels like a good slogan
it
for
feels
an
like a good
adventure game.
motto, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any particularly favorite deaths? I did dig through now that we have the source code.
Oh,
Did a little
yeah.
digging through the jigs up routine to find some good ones, especially since Crypt of Medea has plenty of ways to kill you off. Walk in the wrong room and you get spiked, or you push the wrong button and you get choked. Anything that leapt out to you?
I have to confess that because I was playing it on a much faster system, I was much quicker to just type restore the moment I, got to a death. I didn't really read them too closely. Whereas with Crypt of Medea, you really had to wait for the text to sort of slowly display on the screen before you could do anything. So do tell me, what are the most novel deaths that you've run across?
The one that I really latched onto as that's the good stuff. This is the setting, was a thing like a tentacle with a demonic face wrapped slowly around you. The room recedes into a great distance as you are pulled away. Before you die, you see what the tentacle is a part of. And that's the last
Oh,
message.
that's good.
So
That's
right,
good.
all that, just fill it in. Whatever the scariest thing you can think of, great. I didn't have to write it. There you go.
Yeah, I remember there were some more prosaic deaths, like you could die of cold in a couple of different ways.
Yeah, but even then,
Um,
you are suffused with a warm, blissful numbness. It is marred only by the knowledge that before you wake again, you will die.
oh, yeah, exactly. And that's efficient for space as well, because that's a really short description that really captures, this moment of dread.
I know that there are people out there that have done a lot of, statistical analysis on Infocom games, and it just occurred to me, who wrote the most deaths? It might be Dave.
It could
Between
be.
the Zork games, Spellbreaker, Suspect, this one. I wonder if it's him. Hmm.
It could be. We'll have to do analysis on all of the ZIL files.
So we've talked around some of the more particular puzzles. There's the great elevator hack later on. The reanimated hand.
Mm.
Whether you can microwave it or not, it's a maze navigator, a helpful companion in a way.
It's sort of reminiscent of Thing from the Addams
Yep.
Family, but again, serial numbers filed completely off.
hmm Did you find any other than trying to microwave it, any other interesting and unexpected things to do with it?
No, I didn't, because by that point I was trying desperately to finish in time. And so I was mostly watching to see what it pointed at.
Our appetizer game did not have a maze. This one did a thing that Infocom started to do in the later period, which was, well, we're going to put in a maze, but we're also going to give you, a shortcut or a
Quick
puzzle
out.
solving way to get through the maze.
Yeah.
Leather Goddesses has we're going to tell you what you need to do, as you navigate it. I thought that there was also although maybe it was a debug command to zap past it. And this one, again, it's got the auto nav. If you pair the ring with the hand, I believe.
Yeah, you can follow the hand or whatever the commands are.
And the rats. Yes, lots of
Oh
ways
yeah, the
to be
rats.
done in by the rats. A particularly nasty rat, wise in the ways of death, makes its way up your arm to your neck, and then it goes on for a while. Yeah, like that was one that I noted. I'm like, yeah, this guy can write with a little bit more scope than the Crypt of Medea guys.
One thing we had that was similar in both is that we did have monsters or villains or whatever you want to call them that turned out to be just sort of lumps of something,
Yeah,
slime
you're
or
right.
piles of goo.
The kind of
Yeah.
primordial nature of it.
And as such, the solutions tended to be kind of arbitrary. You just had to know to try to pour or throw whatever it is at it.
Right.
And that said, gosh, I tried throwing that stone at everything that was in my way, because it seemed to be, the game seemed to be leading you into showing you
Yeah.
that this stone is somehow comes from a dangerous place, but is also a useful power that will save you. It's very specific in the situations where it will work.
Being that first element of this is a thing that comes from that initial hallucination. You pick up the stone and then it exists in the real world, which I guess is kind of that first notion of like, well, okay, either this is really happening or you are in a dream within a dream.
Yeah.
But yes, the stone gets you out of a couple tight spots. And it's one of the first areas of the game where when you look at something, you're examining it and says, well, there's a symbol, and you examine the symbol and it's like, well, you know on an intuitive level what this means. And there's definitely some other places like when
your mind glides off of it, or you can't really look at it, but
Same thing with
it's familiar.
With the student who kills himself, it says like, well, the name seems familiar, and then it's a few turns later that the game tells you, oh, it's familiar because you know this and this and this. But this idea of we're going to give you information, but it's almost more the sensation of the information than, and now we're going to tell you a name, a date, a place, information that you can write down. I guess I feel like there's a lot of Infocom titles, and especially the mystery titles are write things down, track what's happening. And this is the guy that also gave us Deadline. So write it down, map it out exactly. Details you can grab onto and apply to the solution of the game. Lurking horror is more okay. Now I know what the vibe is, and that might tell me, right, this stone is super important. I better hang on to it. And as you say, throw it at everything. If it doesn't work, I'll undo. I'll restore. I thought the writing was effective, and maybe because in a similar way to you, I did get that sense of, is this real? Is this not? Is this an unspeakable story? So not having that information didn't frustrate me in the way that might have felt like sloppy or hurried writing, as we sometimes have seen, even in some games we've covered here, where kind of the last third of a game gets a little ragged, gets a little empty. It didn't feel like a lack of ability to convey the information, but rather the character is maybe struggling to process it all.
I think also that aspect of this game reminded me powerfully of nothing so much as Welcome to Night Vale, which, if you don't know, is a storytelling podcast told through the medium of a sort of community radio station in a cursed desert town. The authors, the creators, have always avoided the term Lovecraftian for their work. I think part of that is because they're trying to tell a story of how the people in this town survive all of these horrors by staying together and being a community that takes care of itself and takes care of each other, and respects each other. So I think that's, instead of being a story about going mad and alone and unable to communicate, it's all about these people sharing their experience with each other. And I think that, I've listened to that podcast, since a few years after it started. And this very much has that. It has that same sort of unreliable narrator, possibly. And it has that just, well, here's a tentacle and we're going to get through this kind of feeling.
We know historically this is not the game that pulled the nose up for Infocom. It didn't even particularly set a new standard for text and sound adventures, but they certainly made an attempt. How did you feel in terms of this game, kind of what it reached for and what it grasped?
That's a good question. Again, I think that I still saw this as Lebling telling sort of a love letter to his past, to his childhood, to his adolescence. His times at MIT. And I think that's mostly what came through for me. I don't know how wide an audience there is for that. I don't know if that's the sort of thing that people looking for a horror game might have been looking for. There's a lot of, like you said, there's a lot of microwave simulation going on in here, and details of how a lift goes. There's a lot of very impressive implementation in here. It's something of a sort of a running joke in the Inform community, which is sort of the community that writes modern games to target these platforms, this Infocom platform, that one of the most difficult things to implement is simply a rope. And there is so much rope and so many cables and so many lines. And there is even the chain, which can exist in multiple rooms. And that's where the complexity really appears. And, he did a little bit of sleight of hand to make that work in this game. Whereas the people trying to implement chains and ropes in Inform, they were trying to create general solutions and discovering just how complicated it is. If one end is connected to something in another room and you walk with the other end somewhere else, what should happen? All these consequences happen. And so he put a lot of work into that. And yet I don't know if someone wanting a horror game I don't know. What do they want? Do they want something more like Crypt of Medea, where they can get these sort of visceral thrills of blood and gore? Do they want jump scares? Are the audio cues more what they wanted? It's difficult for me really to figure out what it is that they were trying to do with this, because I think, again, what I take away from this is Dave Lebling saying, "Gosh, it was so much fun to be a university student, at MIT back in the '70s."
Yeah, and all those things included, nearly freezing to death, being harassed by urchins, having to dodge the guy with the floor waxer. Yeah, I think you're right. And with the storytelling framework of, oh, and also there's horrible demons. But I think you're right about that. Yeah, the rope thing. Yeah, we talked about rope mechanics a bit in the pawn in episode 1, and if
That's
I'm
right.
not mistaken, the dialogue language was kind of devised in part to help solve the rope problem, and that's kind of the first proof of concept game is based around a rope tethered, right?
That's right. Yeah.
The world of horror games was going to change pretty radically and in pretty short order. Project Firestart, which is regarded as kind of the first survival horror game, that's only a couple of years away on the Commodore 64 when this one comes out. Of course, Resident Evil and games like that, just a few years later than that. There's certainly no shortage of horror-themed Twine and other kind of choice-based games out there today. So the genre alive and well. Not sure about as parser based fiction if it really took off in a meaningful way. Are there games in the in kind of the modern Renaissance, which we say that's been going on for almost 30 years now, horror wise, that have particularly spoken to you?
I have never really reached out for the horror genre.
Okay.
That's never been something that really attracted me for its own sake. And there are so many games out there. That's one of the things we're absolutely spoiled for choice. It's often difficult even to get through the top 5, award winners in any given year. It's difficult for me to say. I'm sure there's probably got to be something that does a good job of horror for each flavor that somebody might be looking for. But I'm not the expert on that by any means.
So as we wrap up episode 10, Nick, any final thoughts on either of our games?
Oh, let's see. So both of them also, some of the puzzles would disappear if you happen to be a little bit too eager with the personal protective equipment. I noticed both of them had gloves. Certain puzzles were not a problem if you had the gloves on. But the one thing I noticed in the hints for Medea was in that puzzle I described earlier about the grease on the dial. The hint is actually a telephone number, a 7-digit telephone number, no area code or anything. And I won't read it on the air or anything, but I wonder if that was maybe like a radio ad for a lube shop or something.
It had to be. Yeah, I saw
Yeah.
the same thing. And it is worth tracking down the Crypt of Medea instructions. MoCag is probably the best place to find
Yeah.
it. They may also be on archive.org. But it had a nice little, there was kind of a two-step hint process. And one of them gave sort of a more broad hint. And then the other was, use X on Y. And they used kind of a word lookup system. It was fairly elegant. But yes, the phone number clue had to be a well-known, right, exactly, radio, TV, Yellow Pages spot, something which wouldn't make any sense to the broad audience in much the same way that some really insider MIT references are maybe lost on the broader audience. But yes, that really struck me as an unusual way to try to hint that. It wasn't the only hint, and there were other ways to deal with the problems. So it wasn't like you had to be familiar with this local television spot or you were completely doomed. That was an interesting takeaway. Yeah, the crypt, of course, the kind of the premise, although it's hinted at there being, kind of voices and screams in other areas. You'd go to that room and there wouldn't really be anybody there, so you never necessarily saw who was behind the murder hospital. Yeah, of course, and certainly never met Medea.
No.
Again, maybe
Although
it was just...
there was an inscription that if you read it, the game would just sort of hang for me, which I think was meant to be a kind of a death.
Okay.
Yeah. And then also, again, for this murder hospital, I have to know what sort of contractors built that blood shower lift, right? Where you had a blue button and a purple button.
Yeah.
And in order to go up or down, it had to fill with blood and suffocate you.
So bear with me. We're going to need a drain. But wait, there's more. I'm going to need the... Yep. And,
well, you're going to need pipes all over the outside of this. And let me tell you, that's going to cost you. You got to go with copper. Trust me. Yeah.
And lurking horror, to achieve its kind of necessary feeling of isolation, kind of relatively few NPCs, not giving them too many things to do, so we can have the rest of the game. It uses a crippling blizzard, so a lot of areas are just inaccessible.
Mhm.
A sense that everybody else is safely tucked away in their beds because they, unlike you, have done their term papers already. So
Or,
what characters we did encounter, were usually pretty cordoned into an area. The hacker being an exception. He shows up
yeah.
kind of for the end game as well.
I believe the premise to Lurking Horror was that all of the terminals at your dormitory were in use because everybody was doing their papers.
Oh, that's
And
right.
that's
That's
why
right.
you had to go to the main campus.
That's right.
Yeah.
That a very 1987 concept of the computer lab.
Oh, and they lovingly described that PC. It was at a time when what they called the 3M terminal, the 3M workstation, was a design goal for computers. They could do whatever it was. It was a megabyte of RAM, a megahertz of processing power, and a megapixel on the screen. And you'll notice it lovingly describes that 1024 by 1024 display.
The square display, yes, I did
Yes.
notice it was a 1024 by 1024. And as just a side note from two aging game players to whatever youth of today might be listening, I was intrigued by the fact that this really reminds you, the history of the GUI is not. Well, some people use the Macintosh, and then there was Windows 95, and that's when everybody learned about what Windows were. This is a game set in, published in 1987, written before that, and it, pretty casually, even to people that are using machines for whom Windows are not the default interface, but it's like, nope, there's a mouse, there's Windows.
Yeah.
You know what we're talking about. You're a computer nerd if you have this game
Some
in
of the platforms
1987.
would have had that. So, for example, it was released for the Amiga, I think the Atari ST,
Yep.
Macintosh. Those folks would have, been clicking to run the game in the first place,
Oh,
probably.
absolutely. And you're
Whereas
not too far away.
your Atari 8-bit users, not so much.
Right. But I think
Yeah.
there was a sense that, even if you were on a machine that didn't have that, as a native concept, that you were aware of where computing was going.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
You knew it was out there. Because again, you mentioned reading through these books of reviews. And of course, we also had a lot of magazines that showed you what the new computers were going to be like. And you could always sort of flip through the pages and drool over, whatever the next more powerful machine than yours was.
Well, I think we can do no better to sign off of a horror-themed episode than on a mention of drool. So, Nick Moffitt,
Yes, indeed.
thank you so much for joining us on the Retro Adventurers.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to The Retro Adventurers, a podcast about classic text adventure games. This episode was produced and edited by Jason Compton. Please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform, including Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and Podcast Addict. Visit us at retroadventurers.com and follow us on Facebook. The Retro Adventurers is based on a format originally devised by Ben Collier, Jason Compton, and Dave Hawkins.
You are not and here a rising sun from the position of the response. And another response is revealed.